Hello everybody and welcome to the British Library for tonight's event entitled Creating the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, which celebrates an extraordinary archive project that is aimed to restore digitally and virtually as much as possible of the Public Record Office of Ireland that was destroyed by fire 100 years ago on the 30th of June 1922. My name is Alex Locke and it's been my pleasure to lead the contribution of the British Library to this international collaboration which goes by the name of Beyond 2022. I'd like to welcome those of you here in the library's grand entrance hall and the many of you watching online. Soon you'll be hearing from our speakers tonight, Dr. Kieran Wallace, postdoctoral research fellow at Trinity College Dublin and Deputy Director of Beyond 22, and Dr. Sarah Hendricks and Dr. Elizabeth Biggs, Beyond 2022 Research Fellows at the National Archives in London. I'd like to congratulate all those involved in this remarkable project and express our thanks for bringing this event to us this evening, so thank you very much. Later on you'll be able to put your questions to the speakers. Those of you watching online can put questions in the field below your video and they'll be sent to us and we'll be able to ask as many of those as we can. Those of you here in person can ask questions in the usual way, but please just wait for the microphone to get to you. So without further ado, I will now pass over to Dr. Kieran Wallace. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and good evening, everyone. It strikes me every time I hear the project introduced that the words Beyond 2022 are a tongue twister when said at speed repeatedly, so sorry about that. It's great to be here in such a cool, airy space on a very hot day in London, so I hope people watching at home have cool places to sit near a window too. 100 years ago, on this day in Dublin, the Record Office, the Public Record Office of Ireland, our archive, was a large heap of rubble. It had been a heap of rubble for a couple of weeks, and the archival staff were hunting amongst the fallen bricks and mortar to pull out any surviving records they could find. The virtual treasury that we're going to introduce you to tonight is really sprung out of that very early immediate reconstruction work, and so we're sort of building on genuinely on a century of effort to recover from that loss. Beyond 2022 you can think of as like the construction firm that's building a thing, and the thing is called the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. This evening I'll give a brief overview of the project and I'll play our short promotional video, just a 2 or 3 minute video. And then I'll hand over to Sarah, who will talk on her work in the National Archives UK and in other British repositories where she's hunting for replacement records. And then we pass over to Elizabeth, who will talk about her work on the medieval exchequer scheme, the medieval exchequer gold seam, and we'll explain what all these terms mean. We were to be joined on the fourth seat by our colleague Mairead McLean, who is our artist in residence. And unfortunately, she got the dreaded 2 red lines. So Mairead can't be with us here today. She's watching online, and I know she's kicking and spitting, so I'm sorry, Mairead, but you're with us in spirit. But Mairead has sent us a wonderful clip from her video artwork, which she's producing, and some notes, which I will read, so I'll voice her words. So, to business. This one. In 1867, the Public Record Act of Ireland was passed, and this created the context for the Public Record Office of Ireland. And the Public Record Office of Ireland, it was copying what had happened in London 30 years earlier with the PRO here, and it was housed in a purpose-built complex inside the forecourt. So the forecourt in Dublin is a large city block, all the court buildings inside the big railings. And this building was specifically built, they didn't reuse another building, it's a purpose-built, modern, state-of-the-art for the 1860s archival building. They had the task of gathering in records that were scattered in other repositories all around Britain and Ireland, all around Ireland, and bringing them into the record office. These were records which were stored in very unsuitable premises, places with leaky roofs and rats in the basement, and the archives were being eaten away. So to bring them into somewhere safe and dry was terribly important. The key point in any archive, of course, is, and any library like here, is fireproofing, is to make the thing as fire resistant as possible. So if you see on this image, the main building on the front has lots of chimney pots, because that's the administrative block where the staff worked, and they were heated with open coal fires and gas lamps and all the things that bring a risk of fire. So the records were kept in the rear part of the building with the word Record Treasury written on it, the arched windows. And the rear part of the building was lit only by natural light, 10 big arch windows down each side, and a big long glass roof, no gas lighting, no open coal fires. It was heated by hot water pipes, so very modern technology for the time. And the key thing for preserving the records in the record treasury was the fire gap. So this wall in the middle, it looks like a continuous wall. What it is, it's like a stage wall. It's like a front wall. Between the two buildings, there's a void. There's an actual fire break. To leave from the front building to get a record, if you sat in as a reader and you ordered a record, the staff would go out of the front building, across this little 10-yard sort of gap, and then into the record treasury at the back and fetch your record for you. And they called that back building the Treasury. The record treasury is what they called it, because that's how they thought of the records, as treasures. So we've used that word treasury in our virtual recreation. We've only got one photograph of the inside of the building, of the inside sections of the building. This is the only photograph of the reading room or the search room. And here you see the interior where readers went. In the distance in the photograph, you'll see readers doing some research work, and I think some PROI staff trying to look nonchalant but standing in for the photograph. And on the right-hand side of the photograph, the guy to the far right is Herbert Wood, and he was the second in command in the archive when this photograph was taken. Per Herbert rose to be top of the archive when it was destroyed in 1922, but at this point in 1914 he's second in command, and he's writing a book on the collections kept in the Record Treasury. He's writing the Wood's Guide to the Collections in the Public Record Office of Ireland. This was a fairly niche, quite a nerdy book, but that book proved vital for our work because it was describing what had been in the building, so we could begin to reconstruct by finding copies. The man one in from him, so the second in from the right, is D.A. Chart, and David Chart was the third in command in this photograph, and D.A. Chart in 1922 went to the newly established Northern Ireland. Before the archive was destroyed, he took a job transfer up to Northern Ireland, and he set up the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. So the Dublin archive was sort of born out of the learnings from the London Record Office, and the Belfast office was born out of Dublin, so they're all genetically connected in a way. They're kind of three sister archives. We're delighted that on our project, it's the first time that the three archives have worked together on one joint project, is on the Beyond 2022 project. That's the doorway that leads through to the fire break. So that's where the staff went through. You crossed over the void and then into, keep going, into the record treasury itself. Lots of people think this photograph looks like inside a prison, and that's not surprising because it's all metal walkways and metal stairways and metal catwalks to reduce the risk of fire. They took out timber wherever they could. All the shelving is metal. You see the huge glass skylight that's lighting the room. And it was a most successful archive. It operated for 55 years. And all that sort of vital stuff that is invisible but essential that happens in archives and it happens in libraries as well. If you imagine any huge collection of papers, it's just a haystack of papers unless someone puts order on it and says you'll find the records from 2 years ago here and from 10 years ago there, and all the records are in specific locations and they're findable because of an index or a catalogue or a finding aid. That's what they were doing. By 1922, in fact by 1912, the building was practically full. They had very successfully put together lots of finding aids and guides to the collections. And then 1922 came. So there are entire 12-week undergrad lecture series on the 1922 event, so I'll condense it down to a few short sentences for the purposes of this evening. The War of Independence in Ireland lasted from 1919 to 1921, and it ended with the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And the treaty set up the Irish Free State. So the 26 southern and western counties were set up as an independent country with their own parliament in Dublin. And earlier, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland with their own parliament in Belfast had been set up, still part of the United Kingdom. But the treaty was highly controversial in Southern Ireland, and it resulted in a group of anti-treaty activists seizing the Four Courts complex, including the Public Record Office. So this view is showing the Four Courts with the dome in the centre of the photograph. The dark line running up through the photograph is the River Liffey, so the Four Courts sit on the River Liffey, and the photograph is taken from the northwestern side, and you can just see perhaps the only, maybe the last photograph of the Public Record Office before it's destroyed. The tall arch windows, there it is, and it's part of this occupation zone. It's occupied from April until the end of June, by which stage negotiations and talks have failed, and the new emerging Free State Army finally decides to open fire on the premises to drive out the occupying force. And once that happens, you'll see they're using guns borrowed from the British Army, so you can imagine the bitterness that comes out of this, turning on the former comrades and all the sort of politics that comes out of this. So they open fire on the 28th of June, and by the 30th of June, the destruction is really enormous. So that is a view from across the river. You can see the dome of the forecourts, all the smoke pouring out there. And if I just enlarge the left-hand section, you'll see the record Treasury with the roof gone. So the glass roof is gone. And what you're seeing, that smoke is 700 years of Irish history going up in smoke in a single afternoon. I mean, people knew the tragedy, people died, it was a battle, so it's tragic on many ways, but to see the smoke going up was truly heartbreaking. So I mentioned this notion of 100 years ago, people were clambering looking for records. This is what they were clambering through. This is the level of destruction. That's that same archival storage building, and you can see all the metalwork is all twisted. I can nearly imagine that the metal framework collapsed in the heat and the records just poured into the central cavity, and it was like a self-feeding furnace. The photograph on the right with the soldier, he's standing more or less where Herbert Wood and D.A. Chart were sitting in the earlier photograph. So we're looking against that wall where the archivist sat. That front building where the archivists worked, one with the fireplaces and the gas lamps that had a risk of fire, ironically, that's the one that didn't get destroyed, because in the battle and in the explosion, the fire was thrown in amongst the records in the record treasury. The fire break worked, but it worked in the opposite direction. It protected the front building, which was always at risk and losable, from the precious records in the back building. But there was good news in this, because in the front building is where the finding aids, the catalogues, the indexes and all were kept, so they allow us to begin the work of reconstruction. The stuff they were pulling out of the records was what we now call the salved record collection. And the salved records are literally burnt records. The foresight of the archivists who went in amongst the rubble in 1922 and pulled out books that you or I might just throw in the bin and say that's useless was just phenomenal. They found about 200 parcels of records. This is out of tens of thousands, so it's only a tiny, tiny fragment of the entire collection. But they found them out of the rubble. They wrapped them in cotton wool and brown paper and tied them in string, and they shelved them against the day when there might be money or skill sets or technology or something that could do something with these records, and that time has come. So this is one segment of the work that we do is on these and other records as well. Those salved records I truly, like we've been in the room, in the conservators' room, our colleagues Zoe Reid and Jessica Baldwin, the National Archives of Ireland, they unwrap these records and are conserving them and flattening them and smoothing them and moisturising them. And to open a record parcel and to smell the smoke from 100 years ago, it would send chills up your spine, needless to say. So, beyond 2022 then comes into the picture. From 2016, the concept was brought about by Dr. Peter Crooks, our colleague, and the late Dr. Shay Lawless. Peter being a historian and Shay Lawless being a computer scientist. And they said this must be possible to track down copies and bring them together digitally into one central website. And this is what we've been doing. It really is a partnership, a really unique partnership. It's a partnership of historians, computer scientists, and archivists. It's got 5 core partner institutions. That's the 3 state archives in Dublin, London, and Belfast, plus the Trinity College Library and the Irish Manuscripts Commission. So they're core partners that work with us week by week. But more amazingly, in my mind, there are 70 plus other archival institutions and libraries around Ireland, Britain, Europe, Australia, North America that are contributing archives and partners in the work. They give us their expertise, they allow us access to the records, and they're very often contributing digital images as well. And the British Library is an example of such a deep collection of Irish material that is obviously invaluable to us. So the generosity of these partners is what made this happen. The work of Beyond 2022 is funded by the Irish state. It's funded by the Department of Culture in Ireland as part of the decade of centenaries. So you have the same in Britain as well, centenaries of the First World War, centenaries of the end of the First World War. And sometimes historians think, what's so special about a centenary? Every year is special in its own way. But focusing the mind of a funder on a centenary has its benefits, as you will see there. So how do you do it? I'm going to just give you 2 simple examples. You'll hear much more interesting examples from Sarah and Elizabeth. The type of thing we do. So here, for example, is a photograph of part of a page of the Harris manuscripts. The Harris manuscripts are it's a 600-page volume, and there's multiple volumes. This happens to be from a 600-page volume. The scribe who wrote this in 1740 had in front of them records from the Norman invasion period, from the Norman invasion of Ireland, so from the 1290s. And they were transcribing this record out. And so you see there, it is, Edward, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, etc. And they transcribed 600 pages manuscript for a piece of history work they were doing, but the original existed and it survived, and it was in the Public Record Office safe and sound. This was only a copy. When the original is destroyed in 1922 in the battle, what becomes only a copy becomes the only copy, and suddenly it's transformed in its nature. And it's held by the National Library of Ireland, so we take it on board and we scan it and we include it in our collections. So that's one volume, one way of finding things. But sometimes there are multiple volume finds. So I spoke earlier about the records being stored in sort of unusual places, and places where rats and damp and stuff could get at them. That problem, even before there was a record office in Dublin, that problem was known to the government, the Westminster government governing at the time, and they set up the Irish Record Commissioners, which were to go out and hunt down the most important Irish historical records, transcribe them, and print them. So there'd be printed copies in the libraries of the world, and if the originals got lost, it wasn't so bad because you had a backup print copy in many libraries. The Irish Record Commission was closed down in 1830 as an expensive job. They hadn't really produced a huge amount of work. Their printed works are well known, but what's less well known, when they were closed down, that they had lots of stuff ready to go to the printer but hadn't gone yet, and that collection that was ready to go got scattered all around the world, and we've been tracking it down, and we found stuff in California, we found stuff in Trinity College Dublin, not always labelled as Irish Record Commission. It's changed its name over the centuries. The Royal Irish Academy, Maynooth University, and this one, a damaged one from the National Archives with a shrapnel wound from 1922. 350 volumes of beautiful 19th century copperplate handwriting of records from the Stuart and Tudor and late medieval era that's fully legible and nice, neat and tidy and ready for ingestion. So the trouble with a manuscript document, if anybody's ever worked on a manuscript document, is to find anything in it, you have to read everything in it. So to find a single word, you can't, even if I take an image of a manuscript and put it up on your laptop, you have to read it. You can't do Control F to find a word. And to manually transcribe and type out a manuscript document is extremely expensive and time-consuming. So, happily, an EU-funded research project at the same time as we were working had produced this Transcribus artificial intelligence package, and Transcribus can read handwriting. You train it to read different hands. It can read Greek and Latin and German, whatever you train it to read, and it can get better at reading the more you feed it. So when people say the machines are taking over, in some ways I'm glad this machine is taking over. But Transcribus, we can now get it to read, depending on the collection, we can get it to read to an accuracy of 85%. Now, this is not good enough to just press click and print a book, but it's certainly good enough to allow you to find person names and place names in a document. And if I put anybody in front of a historical document that's online, the first thing you will look for is a place name or a person name. That's how we all search. So this has liberated the amount of words we have. We have now 50 million searchable words of text that are connected to the destroyed archive. So we started out thinking, will there be anything? We now have a problem of scale, literally how much stuff is there. In our research, we've been lucky and unlucky. We've been unlucky in some fields of endeavour. So, for example, the 19th century census, so this is the statutory census right through 19th century of Ireland, they were all destroyed, either in the fire of 1922 or earlier. They were not copied extensively, so they can't be traced anywhere else. And that's the thing everybody wants to find. But in other areas, we've found extensive, much more than we expected, extensive copies available. So, let's skip to how we're going to. I'm not where I thought it was going to be. Yep, I'll skip to this. So I thought about the slide there on gold themes, but so we have these particular collections which are extensively recovered, and we call them gold themes because it's like a particularly dense, rich collection of medieval, of Cromwellian era, and of 18th century records. And Elizabeth will talk to you in detail about one gold theme from the medieval period, and Sarah will reference the Cromwellian gold theme. But the availability of some parts of the virtual treasury is really deep, and in other areas like the 19th century census, it's quite thin, and that's just the nature of discovery. We don't know what we'll discover in future sections. The website we built, so here's just a picture of the search. You can search standard search, advanced search, limit by dates, all that sort of thing. You'll also notice in the top right-hand corner, I've just highlighted the VR model, the virtual reality model. So I'll come back to that at the end just to show you that it's more than a toy, but it's pretty cool. So this is a bit on the slow. There we go. So these are the gold seams with these full-scale reconstructions. They are the context in those. If people are researching anything in the gold seams, the surrounding historical context that we have, the essays and surrounding materials, is really quite intense on those. In some areas of the virtual treasury, beyond the gold seams, we actually don't know what we have. We've taken in entire collections, but it's 50 million words. We have not read everything, so it's there for the research community to read and to tell us what they find, or to go off and do their own projects. We don't mind. This is a public good, if you like. So the gold seams we'll come back to later on, but the virtual reality model, this, being honest, archives are not naturally attractive places for the non-expert. People who haven't worked in archives find and I remember well going into archives for the first time, it's not laid out like a Google search interface. It's much more complicated. It's never where you think it's going to be. You have to talk to a scary archivist on all this sort of stuff. So we built a virtual reality model, and this is to allow the curious or the casual user, the non-expert user, to engage with the archive and have a look. They can go on, they can click on various target points, and you can manipulate the thing on your own laptop or on your own tablet, click on targets and hear stories about the collection. Here's, for instance, the VR reconstruction of that reading room. That reading room is was very badly damaged. It's been remodeled as a modern courtroom. But you can go into the reading room, move around it, click on the books, and the books pop open, and you can read elements about the books and learn about people who are in the room and learn about the history of the building. You can also do what nobody could have done, which is go through into the record treasury. So here's a room where nobody's been in 100 years. This is seeing the record treasury in its empty state. You can go up and down the stairs, wander around the empty floors, and on the top floor, we have these amazing pieces of artwork which are fragments the size of your thumbnail that Mairead, our artist in residence, has sort of projected ideas onto these little fragments, and you can hunt for them like a little treasure hunt around. We think this could be useful also for school students, for younger users, and the idea is that you'd get sort of hooked into an idea, and you might then delve deeper into the archive. So I'm going to show you our short video. After the video, we'll pass straight over to Sarah. So enjoy the video, and this still gives me kind of a thrill to see this, considering we've been working for 5 years and now we know it's real.
So I'm sure after that most rousing clip, you're all desperate to go and explore the website, but I'm going to hold you here for a little longer to hear about some of the things that you'll discover once you start exploring what we have. So my name is Sarah Hendricks, and I'm one of the Archival Discovery Research Fellows based at the National Archives here in London. When I began the role back in early 2020, the plan had been to investigate the plentiful Irish material of the National Archives in person. The focus of my search was for records mostly from the early modern period, roughly 1500 to 1800. The material was not completely unknown. Amongst the records were the well-known collections from the Home Office and the Signet Office, as well as copious records and letters from across the years in the State Paper series. But we knew that there were potentially thousands of other lesser or even unknown records, and the aim was to find these. A preliminary search of TNA's catalogues revealed Irish material from the early modern period in the tens of thousands across 59 fonds, with large collections in Chancery, Probate, and the Customs series. Unfortunately, the impacts of COVID meant that in-person identification could not take place, and instead the search for records turned online and expanded beyond TNA's collections to include other core repositories of the UK, known to or suspected of holding Irish material, including the Bodleian Library, the Cambridge University Library, and of course here at the British Library. The result was not simply a longer list of Irish material, but a much broader and richer list that reflected the range of topics and items once held in the Public Record Office. TNA's collections were not forgotten, and rather our efforts were concentrated on identifying and processing a selection of key items. One of these was the unpublished calendar or summary of patent and close rolls for the reign of Charles I, compiled by James Moran, an official in the Rolls Office at the Court of Chancery in Ireland, a precursor to the Public Record Office. And this was brought to the project's attention by Dr. Neil Johnson, head of Early Modern Records at TNA and a close collaborator on the project. The box, when opened, contained just over 600 pages of mostly handwritten notes, most of it quite difficult to read, I might say. His handwriting wasn't the best. These summarized the contents of the patent and close rolls of Charles I in the 9th to 13th years of his reign, 1633 to 1637. The patent and close rolls were two of the key records of English government, and they were a key collection within the Chancery documents of the Public Record Office before its destruction. Indeed, Wood himself noted in the guide that he produced that the patent rolls are the most valuable historical documents, as almost everything of importance was noted on them. For those of us who study other aspects of history, we might question this, but he was not wrong that they contain a wealth of information. Included in the information that you'll find in these notes are clues about individual people and places and the day-to-day workings of Ireland. The range of information in them covers all manners of topics, from grants of land and offices to letters of protection and safe conduct, petitions, wills, grants of fares and inventions. For example, on this sheet, the first item on the top left of the page is a license to Walter Lynn for the manufacture and sale of tobacco pipes. The original rolls were destroyed with the burning of the Public Record Office, and so these abbreviated notes form an important and direct replacement for the lost material. In the 19th century, the Irish Records Commissioners calendared and published a number of the rolls, 3 of which were edited by Moran himself. The notes preserved here at TNA were a draft of a 4th volume, which never reached completion, for whilst he was in the process of editing, he was accused of plagiarism. The project was suspended whilst the claims were investigated, and as part of the proceedings, Moran's box of notes and draft publications was sent to the Master of the Rolls in England, eventually being deposited in the National Archives as part of the case notes. Ultimately, the claims of plagiarism were not upheld, but nonetheless, the publication never recommenced. Today, Moran's unpublished calendars are serving a new purpose, as direct replacements for lost material from the Public Record Office. You can explore them in the virtual record treasury, where they've been placed back on their Chancery shelf and are now in the process of being linked to other material and series across the PROI. The survival of these records is highly unusual. Not all our replacement material has been the subject of an investigation, but it highlights the close associations between the record commissioners and the officers in Ireland and England. Another example of these ties are in the history of the cart papers. This collection, which stretches to over 30 linear meters of material across 279 shelf marks, is housed at the Bodleian Library, having been acquired through a series of donations and purchases. The papers relate mainly to Irish and English history from the outbreak of the Civil War to the end of the 17th century. And whilst not specifically an Irish collection, their value to Irish history was recognised as early as 1863, 4 years prior to the establishment of the Record Office, when the collection was examined by record commissioners to see whether it would be suitable for calendaring, like those patent and close rolls, and copies sent to the Public Record Office in Ireland. 2 commissioners, Prendergast and Russell, were appointed to examine the collection, and on their recommendation, 41 volumes of duplicate transcripts were made and deposited in Ireland between 1868 and 1870. Further volumes were transcribed, but the project was suspended and never completed. On the recommendation of Mike Webb, curator of early modern archives and manuscripts at the Bodleian Library, the Virtual Record Treasury has imaged 3 volumes of Irish petitions, only a small segment of the cart collection, but an important first step to restoring this lost segment of the Proy's holdings. The Moran and Cart papers are examples of large series and collections that have strong direct links to the Proy. But this is not always the case for items that can replace lost material. In many cases, archival discovery has found only a single item or a small collection of documents that are of value. This is more typical of the case at the University of Cambridge Library, where the collections of Henry Bradshaw, a former university librarian and collector of Irish material, has contributed numerous, though very diverse, replacement records. Amongst the finds in the Bradshaw collections are a series of petitions from the early 19th century that cover a range of topics, including voices from both sides of the Catholic emancipation debate, to a petition against the slave trade, the repeal of the window tax, and the abolition of the death penalty, which is the one pictured here. Some of these will require conservation before they can be imaged and platformed on the website, but a selection are already available, and you can explore these through the Virtual Record Treasury. Other pieces of the Bradshaw collection include a document listing the Irish House of Commons for 1790, for the purposes of supplying them with the free delivery of post. These carefully written lists that include names and places are interspersed with accounts and notes for all manner of topics, including the Drogheda Railway, and note the line for the purchase of incense, and what even appears to be a library catalogue for one Mary Ann O'Keefe of Dublin. Another item in the collection are the Irish estate maps, bestowed in 1700 on the Earl of Galway and compiled by Peter Guerin, the Deputy Surveyor General. This beautiful series of maps detail each parish in his estate, with pictorial depictions of each parish and its key characteristics, such as the type of land, red bog or timber wood, or you can see this little village. They're accompanied by a list outlining the profitability of each type of land and parish. The piece is directly related to the maps of the Down Survey, the first detailed land survey on a national scale anywhere in the world and conducted in Ireland between 1656 and 1658. The maps of this survey were part of the Proy's holdings, and the series has now been reconstructed as part of one of the 3 gold seams of the Virtual Record Treasury, the Cromwellian Survey, which again you can explore through the website. As you may have gathered from the examples I've discussed so far, individuals have played an important role in the survival of items, whether picking up fragments and scraps soon after the explosion, or in collecting pieces throughout time. Whether motivated by a professional interest like Moran or Cart, or collectors who sought out thematic content like Bradshaw, much of the survival of replacement material can be traced to the efforts of individuals. This importance was also noted by Wood, who recognised that a large amount of early modern material relating to the history of Ireland was in the possession of individuals. This was due to the history of record keeping across the centuries and the unfortunate, or perhaps fortunate, habit of the Lord's Lieutenant of taking their papers with them when they left Ireland, rather than depositing them with local officials. The happy consequence, of course, is that much of this material has escaped destruction, as it never entered the Public Record Office in the first place. The challenge, however, is in locating these items, whose archival history is often complicated and at times obscure. Thankfully, however, many have made their way into larger collections, either through purchase or donation, and can now be traced through library and archival catalogues. Here at the British Library, collectors and collections have been extremely influential in the repository's acquisition of material, and this has led to one of the largest and most diverse collections of Irish-related material in the British Isles, with connections to material and repositories across the UK, Ireland, and beyond. From an extract of a 13th century Irish pipe roll to a 1799 census in Tipperary and almost everything in between, the collections of the British Library are rich in material that complements and replaces that which has been lost. In many instances, the holdings of the British Library connect to items and collections of other core partners and participating institutions across these islands, and together they replace lost series and collections of the Public Record Office, including the gold seams of the Cromwellian surveys and the Exchequer, about which Elizabeth will speak in a moment. Other, more unique items of the British Library include the hearth money rolls for Tyrone. These were lists of taxpayers who were charged based on the number of hearths or fireplace in their home. The list, which records the place, name of the taxpayer, and number of hearths, was transcribed by Dr. Robert Louis Steele when he visited the Public Record Office of Ireland in 1908, and he made this note when he was there. The list is therefore a direct replacement for a record now lost and has been held here at the British Library since it was presented by Steele in 1934. Records like these, the 1799 Carrick-on-Shore census, the charters and extracts of guild records, are documents that give an overview of the life and times of everyday people in Ireland. There are also, like at TNA, records of the official workings of the Irish government, including notes on cases from the Irish Court of Exchequer and papers of the administration of Ireland from across the early modern period. Although so many of the records found in repositories across the British Isles detail the administration and political functioning of Ireland over the years, there are numerous stories within the documents that can provide a real window into the lived experience of Ireland's citizens over the centuries. And some of these are explored in detail on the Virtual Record Treasury website. This is particularly so for petitions, a common type of document found in the National Archives, the Bodley in Cambridge, and here at the British Library. Like the patent and close rolls, they contain a broad range of information about Ireland and its inhabitants, including personal stories of women as well as men and people of all social strata. I'd like to finish with an example taken from a volume of 18th century petitions to the Lord Lieutenant, purchased at auction by Sir Thomas Phillips, and now here at the British Library. The petition is that of Joan Byrne, a young woman of 24 years of good parentage, now reduced to the lowest ebb of fortune, a convicted prisoner in Newgate. In her petition, she outlines that she was tried for a small felony and found guilty by death, but escaped the fate by claiming she was pregnant. Her claim was substantiated by a jury of matrons and her sentence delayed. The petition says that her charge was altered to that of transportation, but in the time since the order was given, Joan became sick and no ship's master would take her, so she remained in jail. She petitions here for a pardon, as she claims she is, and I quote, "in so sad and miserable condition, in irons and being sick, that she claims she shall certainly die." Her case was referred to the Lord Chief Justice Richard Pine, who 2 years after her original sentence, and in response to her petition, declared that he did not know how her sentence had come to be delayed or modified. His response is brief, and in it he writes, "There were never more robberies than have been of late in this town," of Dublin, "and women have been concerned in most of them. The petitioner is a woman of very ill fame, and in my opinion, no object of mercy, which is most humbly submitted to your grace." Joan's petition was denied, and one can only surmise that her execution was carried out. We don't know what happened to her child. It's a tragic story, but one that highlights one of the many benefits of bringing these records to the fore once again, through imaging, transcription, and linked data. The virtual treasury, through these tools, is enabling these voices and these stories from the past to now be heard and rediscovered. The scale and span of the content available in repositories across the UK, including the National Archives in Kew and the British Library, is vast and contributes knowledge not only about the mechanisms of government and rule in Ireland over the centuries, but the details and stories of the individuals who lived there, like Joan. The items that have been digitised are available through the website and are being made fully text searchable. In some instances, transcriptions are already available, whilst others continue to be added and updated. The process of archival discovery is certainly not over for us. There are still plenty of archival boxes and library catalogues to search through, and much more material to yet add to the Treasury. But I invite you, too, to become archival discoverers of the material already available through the virtual record Treasury. For as you can see, there are plenty of as yet unknown and untold stories and histories waiting to be found inside these items. We just need to start looking. So I'd like to thank you for your time and hand over now to my colleague Elizabeth, who is also based at the National Archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all. We're moving back in time, really. We started with the destruction of the public records in 1922. We've heard about the early modern records that we can put back into the Treasury, and now we're going to think about one of these very deep, very rich collections, which we've been able to reconstruct, not just at the level of items, sync files saying what was in each file, but to the level of the records themselves and exactly what they said. So the Medieval Exchequer Gold Seam is a team of 4 of us on the Virtual Treasury project, myself based at the National Archives UK, where the records are held, Dr. Lynn Kilgallen based in Dublin, working with the digitized images of the records, and Dr. Paul Dryberg at the National Archives with Dr. Peter Crooks and Trinity. So we've been working in parallel across the Irish Sea for the last 2 years. But what we have is what I've been calling for years a medieval shadow archive that exists in London today of original documents that were written in Dublin by the clerks of the English government from the 12th to the 15th centuries, and which contemporaneously, in the medieval period, were brought across the Irish Sea, brought to Westminster, and entered into the records of the English government in London. So we have records, a set of records which were originally part of the collection that would have come down the centuries as the records of the Irish government kept in Dublin, kept in the 4 courts where they were written, but a sort of set of them were siphoned off to London and eventually ended up in the Public Record Office in London, now the National Archives UK. Because the thing you have to understand about medieval government is they're very untrusting. They keep everything in duplicate so that they can be checked. And in the case of the Irish records, and indeed of the English financial records at the same period, they're kept in triplicate. So each set of records of the finances of the English lordship in Ireland are being kept in triplicate, both the payments out of the Exchequer and the payments into the Exchequer from circa 1200, when the Irish Exchequer was founded, right through. The rolls are being kept right up to the 19th century. No one's using them in the 19th century, but they have to be kept, and they have to be kept in triplicate. So every few years, when the Irish treasurer changes, he is summoned to Westminster from the 1290s onwards and he has to bring with him 2 of those 3 copies, and he has to provide every bit of the supporting documentation to prove each line of those records is accurate. Why are they doing this? Because a series of financial scandals in the 1280s and then in 1290 forces them to do this. In 1284, they realized that the then treasurer, Stephen de Fulbourn, has embezzled about 1/3 of the revenue of a single year, and they can't track the money. it's been audited in Dublin. Dublin hasn't managed to find the money, so they go, right, bring it over to London. This then happens again with his successor, Nicholas de Clear, in the early 1290s. And in 1292, the English king, Edward I, says, you will send these records to London. They will be audited not by the Irish clerks, but by the English clerks sitting in the Court of Exchequer in Westminster. So right off Westminster Hall, they're bringing this documentation every few years. So they don't trust these men. This is the Irish Exchequer at work from the Red Book of the Exchequer, written sometime in the 15th century. It's the procedural manual for how to do things in Irish finance, and they give us this lovely drawing of them at work. So the records are first processed and written up there by these men, and then they're brought across to London, where the clerks of the English Exchequer's idea of what an Irishman is the picture on the right. This is the Irish axeman from the Liber A of the English Exchequer, which is their little finding aid for finding the documents relating to Ireland. They put these, so Ireland gets an axeman, Wales gets an archer, Normandy gets a horseman. So you have these little kind of finding aids for it. But that's the English clerk's idea of what they're dealing with is an Irishman with an axe. But what it means is that we have about 400 files of original records written between 1270 and 1446, which were brought across to London, written in Dublin. And that's what the Medieval Exchequer Gold Theme has been working to make available. They're in the National Archives here in Kew. They've been conserved. The conservators at TNA sort of worked through all of them to make sure they could be digitized, and they have now been digitized. We're also very fortunate that in 1998, Dr. Philomena Connolly of the National Archives of Ireland published an edition of the payment rolls, so all the money that the Exchequer was paying out. She edited those and published those, and that was published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission. So we knew that. We have been able to platform her translation alongside the original images. So you can now move from what Connolly's published to the original images and back again. So that's now available on the website. But what the Gold Theme team in particular was doing was translating the receipt rolls. So that's all of the money that's coming into the Irish Exchequer on a daily, monthly, yearly basis. And we've been able to make available the receipt rolls from circa 1270, when the records begin, to 1310, 1315, and more will follow. So by the end of this enterprise, hopefully we will be able to make it so that you can look at not just the records of money coming in, but also the money going out together, and get the best picture of how the Irish lordship was working in those 200 years. That's the aim and that's the hope. But what kind of information can you find in these receipt rolls? Why do we want to do this at all? Well, we get these amazingly brilliant small stories that just pop up. So what I've given you here is 3 snippets from rolls around 1290. And what you've got at the top is a set of entries, and then that's how we translate them and make them available. So you can see that we're working quite hard to keep the format as close as we can while making it usable and translated from the Latin. Fairly important that. So the first set of stories I wanted to bring out from the records is of a woman called Alice de Crum, who in this entry from the 1280s is paying to have a certain writ before the justices of the bench. So she's actively suing in the court of law in Dublin. And she's acting as a single woman, which is interesting for the medieval period. You know, there's no mention of a male relative here. And so I noticed the name, I was like, okay, this is interesting, this is worth keeping an eye out for. But then we see her reappear time and time again. And she's always acting in other people's financial interest, or she's being entrusted with responsibility for other people's financial business. So we see her paying in other people's fines. She's turning up at the Dublin Exchequer with money for other people. We see her guaranteeing other people's transactions. So we start to build up a picture of her as someone who's very aware of the financial world that she's moving in and very much someone that other people are relying on, which is interesting for this period, that we see this woman in the and we can start to make connections with other records, the justiciary rolls, the court rolls of the Dublin government have been published. They were destroyed in the fire, but they have been published for the period sort of circa 1300 to 1330, and she appears in there. So again, we start to begin to build up a picture of an individual from these isolated references where you might not get all that much from a certain writ before the justices of the bench. We have no idea what she's suing about in this particular case, but we can start to build a picture of her life. The second example that I want to use is a woman who I'd very much like to see again in the records. This is Juliana de Howth. So she's from the suburbs of Dublin, from Howth on the northern end of Dublin Bay. But what's really interesting is what she's turning up to pay for. We're told that she has used false measures. And that's a fairly ambiguous term, but what it means in this context is that she has been shortchanging her customers, so using measures that are too small than the standard pint or quart or whatever she's selling. And when we see this in these kinds of records, what we usually are looking for is ale, that she's almost certainly brewing ale and selling it, running a tavern or some kind of home ale business. And she's been giving people too little beer. And that's the kind of thing we'd expect. And I'd love to see her turn up again, because we just don't know anything more about her. Is she a widow who's taken over an established business that a family member has run? Is she someone who has been running this for years? Is this her side? We don't know. She emerges out of the records for this one brief moment and then slips back into the shadows. And it's those kinds of stories that we can start to build up. And the third example I wanted to show is a much more general one. In the 1290s to 1315, we're seeing the absolute height of English power in Ireland. The English power over the island is about 2/3 of the entirety. The Gaelic kings are being pushed back into the north and the west, including to Kerry, which is the third example here on the west coast of Ireland. Yet, here in Kerry, in the 1280s and 1285, we're seeing a payment for wreck of the sea. Now, wreck of the sea is one of those payments the English kings love to try and claim in England. It means the right to anything that washes up on the shore, so bits of ships, bits of anything valuable that turns up on the seashore. They struggle to claim it in England, yet here in the west of Ireland, in an area where English control, even at its height in this period, is extremely tenuous, we're seeing a payment for wreck of the sea. So it says something about how targeted English power in medieval Ireland could be, and how they are able to, at certain points, extract rights that we wouldn't expect to see from them. So these are the kind of stories and the kind of details that we start to pull out from these one-line financial records, and we start to link them together. And it's here at the British Library that we can really start to make those collections. So the gold seam is based at the National Archives. That's where the records are. But there are some absolutely wonderful material here at the British Library, which is material that's absolutely nowhere else. This is possibly my favorite of the medieval Exchequer documents. This is British Library Additional Charter 26515. It is the only surviving fragment that we know of an Irish pipe roll. Now, the Irish clerks in the Exchequer keep 4 kinds of records. They keep the day-to-day payments in and out, which we have copies of at TNA. That's the bread and butter of our gold seam. They keep the pipe rolls, which are the summaries of the financial accounts. So that's all the finance across the entirety of the Lordship of Ireland. Those are almost, other than this fragment, are almost entirely lost. They all went up in flames in 1922. There are some very good transcripts of them, but the originals are virtually completely lost. They keep the memoranda rolls, which are the kind of working memory copies of things in and out. 2 of those survive at the National Archives in Ireland, and again, there are copies and transcripts. So this is just one of very, very few survivors of a kind of documentation we just don't get anywhere else. And it's extraordinary because it's really early. And it must have slipped out of the public records of Ireland into an antiquarian's hands and then made its way through the centuries here to the British Library. But it's from 1261, so it's before the gold seam even begins. It gives us not just the records relating to Waterford, to the city of Waterford, important mercantile centre, but also to the honour of Ulster, which has been granted to the de Burgh family. So it's an unusual look at an area of Ireland we don't usually get to see much in the records. And it's just this one single piece of evidence we have from this period. And once you start looking at that, then you can start seeing how some of the later material might have fitted in. And the second example on this slide is British Library Additional Manuscript 40859A. And this is a kind of an aborted effort at something, because this is from the 1490s, in which there are not very many Irish financial records at all. And it's the attempt to it's the 1390s, and it's an attempt by Richard II to send an expedition to Ireland ahead of what will become his own expeditions in 1394 and then in 1399. He's going to try and send his uncle, Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, to Ireland with an army, and these are the payments for the preparation of that army. In the end, that expedition is cancelled, and instead Roger Mortimer becomes Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. But here, in this collection, we have a look at the finances of the English lordship's attempts to regain control at the end of the 14th century, and the ways in which it's thinking about Ireland in that period. And there's a period in which we have nothing from the Irish Exchequer. As it happens, that's a period in which the accounting in Westminster didn't happen. So it's an extraordinary survival. And then we come to some of the later copies and transcripts which were made and which provide evidence for things that we might otherwise not know of, or that we can start building connections with the original materials that survive. This British Library Royal MS 18C14 is many things. It's a 1490 set of accounts relating to Ireland, but possibly it's, from my perspective, the most interesting thing is that it copies in a lot of earlier Irish Exchequer material, including this, which is just an extract from the accounts of Geoffrey de Turville. Again, it's very early, it's the 1260s, and it's just picks out a bit that they thought they would need 2 centuries later. And this is the kind of material we work with and that Archival Discovery work with, where we take later copies that are fragments and try and bring them back together. So we've got that. And then this is British Library Additional Charter 74919. And again, it's an extraordinary survival just in itself, that it's issued in Dublin at the King's Court on the 13th of February, 1637, under the Great Seal of Charles I. But what it is, that in itself is amazing. You know, we've got a charter from that. But what it is a copy of an extract of the pipe roll, those things that we have very little fragments of, from not just the medieval period, but from 1268 to 9. So in 1637, they've gone back to the pipe roll of 1268 to 9 and copied this out. It was presumably important in some kind of dispute over land. It relates to 25 cantreds of land in Connacht, again in the west of Ireland, which at the time was a part of the de Burgh earldom in that area of Ireland. So that we have this, and that we can start to pick out the pieces from it and work out, you know, what it relates to and how we can start linking these objects together. And it's issued in Dublin. It's showing the Dublin clerks working with these records, the records that survived to come into the record office in 1867, and also the records that didn't make it in. You know, we can go back and pick apart exactly whether, you know, we could find that pipe roll or not on the shelves in 1867, because the pipe rolls were mostly there in that period. But what then do we do with all of this? Because it's amazing to be able to identify this material and to say, this is what was there. But the real power of the virtual treasury is in being able to draw those connections and being able to bring things together that we wouldn't have been able to bring together previously. So what I've given you on the slide here is a picture of that linking together quite literally. That's Irish Exchequer Payments, the edition by Philomena Connolly. But it's next to one of the rolls that she used. And now we can put those together. That's one kind of link we can make. But thanks to the work my colleague Lynn Kilgallen has been doing on what we call the knowledge graph for Irish history, we can start to take the names and the places and the organizations that inhabit these records in their physical form and start pulling them out and linking them. So, for example, you would be able to look for every bit of material that relates to Connacht and see that, the British Library material is there, but there are also the various references in the issue rolls and the receipt rolls and in the material that Archival Discovery has found. So you can bring records together, not just in printed form, but from around the world digitally. And with that, I'll hand back to Kieran and the work that Mairead McLean's been doing.
Cool. Thanks, Elizabeth. So I hope that gives you some flavour of voices that were thought to be silenced, a situation that was thought to be completely hopeless 100 years ago, the amount of detail just in 2 short presentations, and there's tons more. Like I said, we don't know what's in the collection because some of what we brought in is so vast we can't have read every word. But these voices that are being liberated out of the past, I think, are quite exciting. I now want to introduce, virtually, because she's not with us, Mairead McLean, our Decade of Centenaries artist in residence. She's been embedded with our team for about the past 2 years, year, and the scheme, the Artist in Residence scheme, is set up by the Department of Culture in Dublin to attach artists to various archives around Ireland during the centenary year. And we had no idea what we were getting into. We knew we'd like the idea of an artist coming to work with us, but it's been an extremely satisfying, and we were talking earlier, it's been a fun experience, and what an artist brings to any work you're doing is amazing. So I think whatever your job is, try and get them to give you an artist to work alongside you. Mairead is an artist who works at film, video, sound, and photography as her primary media. She's interested in the subject of memory and how and why we remember what we do. Her work has been displayed in galleries and museums in the UK, Ireland, and further afield, and she's won several awards and art prizes. She has work held in the National Collection at the Irish Museum of Modern Art and the collection held by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. In this coming October, her solo show, On Balance, will be held at Belfast Contemporary Photographic Gallery, Belfast Exposed, as part of the 60th anniversary of the Belfast International Arts Festival. So, the next piece I'm going to, this is a short introduction to give you a context for a video clip I'm going to play for you. And this is an excerpt from Mairead's artwork, a work in progress that she's making at the moment. So this is in Mairead's voice, if you like. I'm not going to impersonate her voice, but this is Mairead speaking. So as artist in residence at Trinity College Longroom Hub, embedded with the Beyond 2022 project, this residence has given me the opportunity to reflect creatively, not only on the ramifications of the destruction of the record treasury in 1922, but also on the mammoth task that's gone into rebuilding it in the virtual world 100 years later. It's also given me a chance to reimagine this archival story through the lens of my own experience. This is Mairead speaking. Mairead growing up in a small village in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, going to art college in Belfast, and then on to the Slade School of Art here in London in the 1980s and 1990s, where I spent many years living and working, she says. More recently, I've been in Dublin working with the team on this unique archival adventure. My own personal journey reflects the connections that have been built between the archives in Belfast, London, and Dublin through this project, and the idea that, as neighbours, our history can be viewed as a shared one. So, when we were setting up the event here today, I was speaking with the audiovisual technical experts here, and they described this space as a reverberative space. And that's quite funny because they didn't know that this slide, one of the themes in Mairead's work is reverberations. And Mairead writes, the talk I would have given if COVID had not come calling would have had this as its title. Reverberations refer to something that lasts for a long time and that can make things shake or become unsteady. Reverberation time refers to the time taken for a sound to disappear or fade away. I associate these words with this image, taken from the newsreel footage showing an army officer holding his hands to his ears as the shells are being fired at the forecourts in Dublin in 1922. On first seeing this footage, Mairead writes, I imagined that the sound that day must have been deafening and the impact so great that the explosion would have been felt not only through the bodies of the people in the city, but long after, through the loss of the archive for people not only in Ireland, but in the Irish diaspora around the world. The film excerpts that follow introduce some of the ideas in my film entitled The Nick of Time. The title references the nick made on medieval tally sticks. So tally sticks were an early way of recording information or transactions by cutting notches or nicks in a short stick of wood. And the fact that the archives have been saved just in time through the work of the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland team. The film, currently in production, explores ideas around memory, time, archival recovery, and the work of conservators, and the story of tiny fragments of documents saved from the fire itself. So I'll play the video now. It lasts about under 5 minutes, and then we'll go directly to questions and answers, which will be chaired by Alex. Mairead's film is funded by the Arts Council of Ireland, and it will be released in 2023. So here's a sneak peek. I hope you enjoy it as much as I always do.
Striking the prongs distorts them. Like other solid objects, these prongs resist distortion. They spring back and forth, thus producing new distortions. Each movement or vibration sets up new disturbances.
Ready? Get rid of that stuff. Okay. So you do that. Oh, let me see it in there. Lovely. Okay, and I'm going to turn it
Fascinating, thank you, and reminds us of, though we think this material sort of stands here for forever, has been here forever, how fragile it can be in certain circumstances. And so, yeah, quite thought-provoking and quite moving. So thank you very much. So I'd now like to open the floor to questions. If you're online, please feel free to type in a question, and they'll get fed through to me, and I will ask our panel. So do feel free to ask questions. For those of you watching online and anyone in the room, please just put up your hand and ask questions as normal. We'll bring a microphone to you. So if there's anyone with a burning question to go in the room, otherwise I can begin online, which is what I think I'll do in this case whilst you gather your thoughts. We have a question from one of our viewers online about how confident are you about what you know you can't recover? Is the full extent of the 1922 losses known, or are there gaps in the knowledge still? Is it possible that there are still troves of missing material to be discovered that you've yet to know you need to discover them?
I'll give the stock answer and then turn to the discoverers. There are definitely unknown unknowns for sure. And that might be a nice way of asking about the 19th century census, because that normally comes up. Surely the census is hidden under a bed somewhere. But we have discovered such unlikely stuff in unlikely places that it's really hard to tell where stuff will turn up. So I think if the inquirer is asking about, like, we don't know, we go in with hope into all sorts of archives. We've discovered stuff literally in the attic of big houses, big Anglo-Irish houses in the countryside in Ireland. We've discovered stuff in organised libraries like this. We've discovered photographs. Sorry, I say discovered, I should be very careful. No archivist, sorry, if you go to an archive and say you discover something, they'll say you didn't really discover it. You looked it up in the catalogue, we brought it to you in a nice box in a folder with a label on it. You didn't discover it. So I should say, we identified its relevance to our project. So I should be very careful here, and archivists are quite right. But we've discovered, we've identified items that in the most unlikely places. So I would think there is constant hope, and we do keep looking. And the more we talk to archivists, the more stuff sort of emerges, as our understanding of it deepens, and it becomes more relevant. I don't want to jump in on
Yeah,
that.
it's an interesting question, because we have a few starting points to get an idea of what we think we're looking for. Wood's Guide, of course, we mentioned earlier, and there are other materials that give us quite detailed information. But Wood's Guide is an interesting one because there are some entries that are very, very specific about what was there. So the guild records, for example, will tell us exactly which guilds and which items and which dates they covered, and so we can trace what we do or don't have to quite a fine level of detail. But then you'll get something else, which will be, departmental letters, correspondence.
Yeah.
And that's about it. And so there's no idea of, and it will cover 100 years. So knowing exactly how much was there and what it covered and what it entailed is something we'll never be able to answer. The other thing, of course, which comes back to some of the notes that I showed in these, is we don't know who went there as researchers and made notes. So not everyone that went there was going to make copies and transcribe parts of these documents for publication or as researchers or in official capacities. So like Steele's half money rolls that ended up being donated to the British Library, I'm sure there must be plenty out there that people have made over, back in the time, that are in private collections and who knows where, that we just don't know exist. So if anyone stumbles across anything, please let us know.
Thank you. Any questions from the room? Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up.
So yeah, if you just wait for the microphone side.
Yeah, just a follow-up on what you were saying. Did you issue a call for these things at all, or are you just relying on people's knowledge, or did you make a public call in places where you think they might exist?
To be honest, and between ourselves, nobody else listening, we were too scared to. Because there's a small team, and it's just hard to know what would come at you. The last thing we want is a physical item, because we know where to store it. They should be stored in proper places. But information has come at us from the archival and library and scholarly community, and members of the public have come along and said, I know of a collection in a solicitor's office or something like that. So we sort of keep a list of these carefully to follow up for future cases, but we haven't actively called. But even without that, information has come towards us because of the generosity of people. Yeah. But I think it's, as the project is only being launched, it's growing all the time. So I think that idea of a call about specific types of records and specific zones of the world will certainly emerge over time, for sure.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, do just raise your hands in the room, but we've got some coming through online as well. We have a question here relating to the languages in the repository. So apart from Latin, are there any documents in other languages, particularly in Norse or French? Or?
The law court records of the medieval law courts in Dublin would have been in French. It's clear from the financial accounts that the clerks writing those would have known French. They use French words regularly. They almost certainly are picking up some knowledge of Irish, because sometimes Irish words creep in, or they're being told Irish words and they write down what they see. So we see traces of other languages. The law court records would have been kept in French, and some of the other outgoing documentation would have been in French as well.
So if I can just jump in on to add to that, the archive was set up in the 1860s. I think in the 1890s, scholars said, can you tell us what Irish language material actually originating in Irish that you have? And they did a big trawl through their thousands and thousands of records, and they came up with 5 items only written in Irish. And so they produced an appendix to, I can't remember the year, I think it's 1896, the annual report, and the appendix is a print in Old Irish script of each of these 5 items and an English language translation. But it is the record collection of the English government in Ireland. One of those articles, one of those items is interesting because it is a transcript of a Brehon law judgment. So Brehon law was sort of a non-written form of law, so it was an orally delivered law form. So where some Gaelic scribe had written down a Brehon law judgment, which is really unusual, and that survived through, but only 5 out of 5 stories of 10, 100,000 feet of square feet of shelving, and only 5 items in the Irish language. Yeah,
that's incredible, isn't it?
It's odd.
And are there any surprising documents in there that that are in languages or from locations which you're just surprised to find being in that record?
I don't know why you're both looking at me.
Archival discovery.
There is one, but if I can jump in, sorry. The archive is meant to be the state archive, so it's the back catalogue of official civil service business. But amazingly, other stuff seems to fall into the boxes with it. And one boring set of port records, import-export records, the guy who died and left all his records, his wife's domestic diary went in with it, her housekeeping diary went in with the records and ended up going into the record office, being written up and printed and then getting destroyed in 1922. But the contents of it are saved. So the diary of Mrs. Bailey, B-A-Y-L-Y, and it's a wonderful account. I think after her husband has died, she lives on as a prosperous widow in Dublin for about 20 more years, and she raises her daughters in Dublin. So she's describing mid-18th century, where they go socializing, what their education is, what books they buy, what shows they go to, how much they pay for a carriage and a sedan chair and all that kind of stuff. And that's not at all, that's purely domestic, but it ends up in the record treasury. So we have the later edition. The original was burnt, but so that item was something I found that was great to get that voice in the diary, in the archive.
Thank you. So yeah, lots coming in online. So we have a viewer saying, it was very moving when you spoke about the archivists in 1922 scouring through the rubble. Do you have any first-hand accounts of the early efforts to save the archive? And is this available online on the Treasury website?
Yes, I'm sorry to be hogging all the talking here, but so Zoe Reid, who's the keeper of the National Archives Ireland, has done a lot of work on this immediate response to the catastrophe, and there are letters of people writing to each other saying what a terrible thing has happened, and the immediate arrival of, well, not immediate, it took about 2 days for the battle smoke to clear and to check there was no explosives and so forth. But within days they were going in and sifting through the rubble, and it took them a year of literally turning over stones to find stuff. I think on the National Archives Ireland website there is currently a blog entry about that early initial sort of salvage effort. Frankly, had it been myself, I would have walked away in disgust and just retired. How could you face this? But they were just such determined people to do it, and they've enabled us to do what we're doing now because of that. So I think the NAI blog might be helpful. Yeah.
There's also the exhibition in the Irish Architectural Archive at the moment, which is about the history of the building from when it was built right through the efforts of reconstructing, and they pulled out some of the material relating to the salvage efforts there. So I imagine that will go on the
physical
website
salvage, yes, exactly.
as well.
Good one.
So, well,
From something you said earlier, I think you're not very optimistic about the census records being recreated. Without going too much into known unknowns, are there potential other geographic locations for record offices within Ireland or back in the UK which might in future give some hope for recreating those?
It's something that gets a huge amount of attention, and even to find a fragment gets a big spotlight. So there's a lot of work going into it. I don't wish to sound sort of hopeless and dismissive, but hopeless is based on lots of negative leads, let's say. But some interesting things have turned up, which keeps a small glimmer of hope alive. So, for example, the census was run, there was a sort of a dud census in 1813, and then a proper census in 1821, 31, and so forth through the decades. A section of the 1821 census, for example, was, I don't know how it came to be copied, for one landlord's estate in County Kilkenny, and that's quite a big estate, and he got a copy of all, I mean, don't know why he was entitled to it, but he got a copy of the census for his land, which he then used as a rent roll collection to see who was there to pay rent. But that was unknown until we were giving a talk to the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, and someone said, did you know, in my attic, so exactly the point that you're making and the thing, sort of unknown unknowns. So because there's a lot of attention to the Irish census, people tend to know what's in their attic if it's census related, but still things do come forward. There are possibilities of possibly rebuilding elements of the census using landed estate records. Landlords kept good records of who owed them rent. And if you were to get a universal set of, it would be impossible to do, or almost impossible to do, but if you were to get a universal set of all landlords' records and say who owed them rent in a given year, if it's close enough to a census year, that could be a way of going towards rebuilding the census. But it's that kind of clever thinking and linking things against the grain that would do it. But it's something that we are thinking and talking about for the next phase of work, to do it as a trial on one county. Yeah, we'd love to do it, we'd love to do it.
There's a lady in green just...
You mentioned smelling the smoke when you were looking at the old records. How much of that kind of hands-on working with the original paper records did you get to do, and what was that like?
Well, you can speak more. You can.
Well, I didn't quite get to do as much as I had hoped due to various lockdowns and access issues. So as I said at the beginning, it was meant to be quite literally rummaging through boxes. Oftentimes, I mean, in most archives and repositories, but certainly at TNA, there are parts of the collection where we know there's material, but it hasn't been catalogued properly, or it hasn't been looked at for a long time. And so that's something that, is now into the next round of what we'll be doing, is actually going through and revisiting these pieces, in their physical form. But some of them where we looked into them in greater detail, like the Morin papers, for example. They were an example that hadn't been catalogued, so those we worked with quite closely in actually putting them into their correct order. So the archival numbering that they had was inaccurate, shall we say. It had been done a long time ago and hadn't been done based on the content. So with those boxes and materials, we were working with them sort of every day for a while whilst we were putting them back into the order that they needed to be. So from my own experience, it really was on a case-by-case basis, depending on the material we were working with and what we needed to really do with it. I mean, sometimes conservation was another aspect where we really got close to the material as well. So the Cambridge petitions, the librarians looked at them and said, some of these, they're just not in a stable enough condition, and I think some of the British Library material as well needed to go through some conservation before it could be imaged. So on those, people are looking at them and very close up to them, but it's not always us, I guess, in the process of making them available.
And I had a sort of dual experience, because we were very fortunate. The core medieval Exchequer Goldstein material was digitized just before the pandemic. So there were 400 files worth of thousands of images that we knew we'd be working with. But any digitization, there'll always be folds in the parchment where you can't read something, or, so I sort of spent a lot of time staring at digital images, trying to make out blobs on images. But then I'd go in and check things specifically. Or I was actually at TNA this morning to check a roll because the catalog description said one thing. It was reasonably accurate, but it made me think it was a much longer roll than it was. And the digitized images, I couldn't see how they fit together. I couldn't see how the roll had been constructed. So I went in this morning, opened the roll. Parchment wants to stay rolled up, so you're kind of trying to fight it a bit to get it to open properly, and looked at what was the top membrane, the top sheet of parchment, and went, that doesn't match the images. Oh no, I've got a problem here. I then realized that very unusually, instead of being a roll where every sheet is sewn to the next one and rolled up, they'd sewed them all together at the bottom. And for some reason, whoever did the numbering at TNA in the last time it was conserved, had numbered it 5 and 6 as the top ones, and 1 was the bottom one. So once I worked out the order, I think, oh yes, these images do line up. They're just sewn in a way. So it's that kind of working with both the digital, which gives you lovely, flat, beautiful images most of the time, with some few folds that right, you can't read this. And then the actual reality of medieval parchment, which is springy once sewn the shape it's been in for the last 700 years, and may not be in the order or the stitching pattern that you expect. It's been that dual aspect of working with this material.
It's surprising how dirty your hands can get sometimes. It's just like, you think it's a nice, neat job being a historian, but you come out and you think, my hands are black. And I think they should give you aprons, actually, to wear. To pick up some volumes, you're just covered.
So I just want to ask one question from online. I think we had another question in the room, but then we're probably running out of time. But the last question from online viewers is, your map seems to show that only archives in English-speaking countries are involved in this project. Is that intentional? And if so, might there be material in archives of non-English-speaking countries?
What an astute audience. So we did not get to, because of lockdown, we did not get to mainland Europe to do, and that was our main sort of of the non-English-speaking world. The documentary diaspora seemed to follow where Irish people emigrated to, and Irish people in modern times emigrated to English-speaking areas. But of course, in the earlier period, they were emigrating largely to Europe, to France and to Spain particularly. So we know there are some records there, we just haven't got to them yet. And there's an excellent collection, the O'Fee collection in Armagh, so the Cardinal O'Fee collection, which reflects some of that European holdings. So that's something that's on our list to do as we go forward into the next sort of phase of work. But the European work is, you're right, the map doesn't show it because it wasn't true at that time, but it's definitely on our to-do list, and that's one casualty of COVID. But they're still there, they're still safe, so if there is stuff, we'll find it.
Thank you. And then I think we have time for one more question if there's anyone in the room who would like to. Yeah, this lady here.
Did you find anything scandalous or that shouldn't have been for public information locked away in the archives when you went through them, or secreted somewhere that was a bit surprising when you read it?
I'm sure there are stories in there. I guess part of it is, so we have quite a few volumes of letters, actually, which are meant to be mostly official correspondence. But there are hundreds of letters in these volumes that can themselves number close to the hundreds. And to be honest, I haven't read them all. So there could well be some very scandalous stories in there. And I think that's the exciting bit of the next phase is we've done so much, we've spent so much of the last 2 years finding the documents and finding out about them. Now we actually get to read them and find out what's in them, which is, it sounds kind of bizarre, but it's one of the questions of volume is actually doing the history. So none immediately come to mind, but I will definitely be on the lookout now, that's for sure.
I've got one in that I've had the fun of reading the administrative records of the Public Record Office of Ireland itself. So it's what the staff are doing, what the archivists are doing. And I mean, there were people fighting over salary levels and people wanting pay raises and all that sort of HR stuff. But there was a collection, an important collection of Irish records kept in Kilkenny Castle. And the Duke of Ormond was letting people in to look at one of the Ormonds was letting people in to look at the records in the 19th century. And the archives in England said, why don't we take all the archives from Kilkenny that relate to England and bring them back to London? And this was going through during the summer holidays of the chief archivist in Dublin. And the chief archivist from Dublin got back from his holidays and he said, absolutely not, this time we must have home rule. If there are Irish records in Ireland, they stay in Ireland, and he just killed it. But his second in command had been going ahead with this, sort of splitting the collection and sending half back to England, and we thought, enough of that. So they kept it all in Ireland, where it was all burnt.
How about you, Lizzie? Anything?
I'm trying to think. The problem with the gold seam is that it's all the official records, so it's the stuff that doesn't get into the records that's scandalous. It's the, you know, the embezzlement, or where did that money go, or they spend 20 years going after one of the treasurers of Ireland for fraud and embezzlement involving the Knights Templar. That makes it into the English records, and you sort of see the process, and I'm working on those records at the moment, and you look at the Irish records and you go, these are a real mess. Is this because he's just causing problems left, right, and centre, and we're seeing it in the way these documents have survived? So we don't get any, we get this sort of void of scandal that they're sort of working around, trying to make it look nice for mine.
Brilliant. So I suppose on that note, we'll sum up. And so thank you very much. Thank you for introducing this amazing project. Thank you for everything you're doing. It's so incredible, and it's wonderful to be part of working with you as well from the British Library's point of view. So if we could just give our panel a round of applause, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Alice.